When you listen to Zamrock now, it sounds like bright chaos. Fuzzed guitars, grinding rhythms, sudden eruptions of horn and chant. That sound grew out of a moment of possibility in 1970s Zambia, but threaded through that music is a quieter, crueler story. An epidemic that took more than voices. It took careers, friendships, and an entire generation of musicians whose experiments and risks briefly set the country alight. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Zambia was a young nation, newly independent and brimming with optimism. The country's urban youth had growing access to shortwave radio, record players, and imported vinyl. Western rock bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were in heavy rotation at clubs and parties, inspiring Zambian musicians with their catchy melodies, rebellious lyrics, and guitar-driven arrangements. Meanwhile, Jimi Hendrix's psychedelic guitar wizardry electrified a generation of aspiring Zambian guitarists. His experimental use of distortion, wah-wah pedals, and feedback found its way into the emerging local sound, encouraging artists to push the limits of what their instruments could do. On the rhythm side, James Brown was making waves worldwide with his funk grooves and tight, syncopated beats. He visited Zambia in December 1970, delivering 2 electrifying concerts, one in Lusaka at the Mulungushi International Conference Center and another at Dag Hammarskjöld Stadium in Dola on the Copper Belt. Zambian drummers and bassists absorbed this percussive style, infusing rock with infectious dance rhythms that gave the local sound its distinctive, foot-stomping pulse. However, in the mid-1970s, the Zambian government under Kenneth Kaunda introduced a policy banning foreign music from the airwaves during prime listening hours. This radio ban was meant to promote local culture and encourage the growth of a national music identity. For many young bands, this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they could no longer rely on Western hits for exposure. On the other, it forced them to fill the gap with their own compositions. The result was an explosion of creativity, and Zamrock was born. Musicians blended the rock and funk influences of their Western idols with traditional Zambian melodies, rhythms, and storytelling, creating something that was neither purely Western nor purely traditional. This fusion became the backbone of Zamrock, a genre that was raw, experimental, and proudly Zambian. Emmanuel, Jagari, Chanda, and Ricky Ilalonga were not the only pioneers, but they became the faces of what was lost. Jagari's band, Witch, blasted Zambia's first commercial rock LP into the world in 1973. A ragged psychedelic thing pressed after a 2,000-kilometer trip to Nairobi. Ricky led Museo Tunya, fusing local pulse and Western rock after hearing Osibisa and deciding Zambian music could be both home and horizon. Paul Ngozi and his Ngozi family brought a different urgency, streetwise lyrics, singable hooks, and a voice that spoke to everyday struggle. Together with Keith Mlevu, Amanaz, The Peace, Blackfoot, and others, they built a fearless scene. For a time, the country fed them. Under President Kaunda's push to modernize and his radio quota for local music, stadiums filled and records sold. Young people with paychecks wanted to dance and buy songs. The bands toured across southern Africa. They slept in cheap rooms, drank late, and kept going. That lifestyle, the long nights, the intimacy of touring, the inflation of fame in a small market with limited healthcare, made musicians vulnerable in ways the music press didn't register at the time. By the 1980s, 2 broader forces converged and began to hollow the scene. The global price of copper collapsed, shrinking incomes and shrinking the audience that once poured money into concerts and record racks. Political pressure, curfews, and blackouts made touring and late-night gigs dangerous or impossible. Then the epidemic arrived, quietly at first, and then everywhere. AIDS. Many in the music community either lacked access to good health services, information, or the means to protect themselves. The disease hit musicians hard, the very people whose work had defined a brief national optimism. The human cost was immediate and intimate. Bands that had been tight musical families fractured under loss. Solo careers that seemed unstoppable stalled. Planned follow-up records were never made. Jagari stepped away from fronting Witch and into a steadier life teaching music, choosing stability for a young family over the uncertainty of club life. Ricky left for Denmark, carrying both his songs and the grief of friends who did not leave. Paul Ngozi shifted toward more commercial, danceable Kalindula sound, partly as survival, to reach wider, more local ears when the old market collapsed. For many, the choice wasn't artistic, it was survival. Deaths from what are widely believed to be AIDS-related complications took a heavy toll. Entire lineups disappeared. Master tapes and session reels were neglected, damaged, or lost when families could not preserve them. The scene's oral history survived in memories and on scratched vinyl, but the living networks that sustained the music were gone. Where there had once been touring circuits, there were funerals. Where there had been boisterous late-night shows, there were empty venues and quieter lives. For decades, Zamrock receded into a kind of national amnesia, rescued only by the stubbornness of collectors and the curiosities of crate diggers. When foreign labels and researchers began to track down old records, they found not only exceptional music, but a catalog of absence. Half the bands had no surviving members to tell the story, and many albums existed only as battered singles or cassette copies. The rediscovery was bittersweet. Jagari and Ricky survived, each carrying loss into later revival tours, but they were survivors of a scene that had been painfully pruned. That pruning shaped the music that followed. The voices that could have matured, experimented, and mentored younger players were gone. Their silence redirected the flow of Zambian popular music toward new forms. At the same time, European and American interest in reissues allowed a kind of delayed vindication. Reissued records, compilation CDs, and online uploads introduced Jagari, Ricky, Paul Ngozi, and their peers to audiences who never lived through the highs and the losses. Concerts in Europe and the US reunited some of the living musicians with applause, but every encore was underscored by the memory of what had been lost. Telling Zamrock's story through the lens of AIDS does not reduce it to tragedy alone. It sharpens how fragile cultural moments can be when health crises intersect with political and economic shocks. It makes the music sweeter and harder, joyful because it existed at all, tragic because so many hands that shaped it were taken. Jagari's and Ricky's later performances carry that double note, resilience braided with mourning. Paul Ngozi's recordings carry the grit and urgency of someone singing against a narrowing world. When you play a Zamrock record today, you hear the tracks that survived, and if you listen closely, the silence where others might have been. The music that returned after decades of neglect is now heard not only as a stylistic curiosity, but as testimony to creativity, to loss, and to the way an epidemic can rearrange the shape of cultural history.